work session for the town. If we can please stand for the invocation. Brother Jay.
Holy Father, we just thank you for this opportunity to gather here today, Lord. We just ask that you continue to use us and for the betterment of this town, Lord, and let us do these things in accordance with your will and your direction. For us in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank y'all. Let's see. I need to have a motion to accept a phone-in participation.
So moved.
Thank y'all. All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All righty, since there's no public here, we'll do away with public comment. Do I have a motion to adopt the next agenda?
So moved.
All right, first thing on the agenda is to consider the Matthews property lease. The same farmer wants to lease his property again. I guess it's not time to plant anything, usually he plants in the spring, but it says lease is up, so we need to go ahead and renew that. If I can get a motion to approve his lease of that property.
Second.
Motion is second. Is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Thank you, Brother Bailey. All right, now the whole reason we're here is to get educated. And I need to welcome Mr. Chris to the town council. He's been doing a study for going on 3 years, right? 3 years or more.
Two and a half on this particular
Just-
one, yeah. Plus
yeah.
some stuff before that.
It's been a while,
Yeah.
especially if you look down at what he's done for Cedar Island and Paramore and holy cow. All right, you're up.
All right, thanks. You know how much a William Mary student pays for an hour of education by me?
Well, I paid for 4 years, so.
They don't pay me, mind you. But yeah, that's right. All right, so update. That's what I'm here for. I was here, what, 2-3 years ago? Pre-pandemic, so whenever that was. To kind of introduce what we were planning on doing, get some thoughts on that at that time, and give you some sense as to how a geologist looks at this area and some of the changes you are seeing, and see what we can try to pull out of that by putting our heads together on it. So we've had a few years to work on this now, and I've got some updates for you. Now, a few of you, I know, Arthur, I think you were at the
Yes, I was.
at the talk. So some of this is going to be, I'm going to go through that just because it is kind of interesting. But I'm going to emphasize here the modeling work that we've been doing as well. And that's kind of fades into the background a little bit. But I think it's a neat story worth telling again. So you could punch out for that part of it. All right, so this all starts, as you know, Chincoteague, an old barrier island. I mean, it is still a barrier island in a way, but not one that's ocean facing, obviously, except at the inlets, not like Assateague, which has grown in front of it and has made it and largely protected it. Those which do not have the benefit of an island sitting out east of them are moving very, very quickly. These are something new we've put together just this summer. This is a map of, obviously, the Virginia Barrier Islands. And what you're looking at there in the yellows are old shorelines from the 1800s, and then grading over to the browns are more recent shorelines of each of those islands. And you can this kind of gives a sense of how fast these islands are moving. Up in the numbers there, after the name of each island, is the rate that island shoreline is moving landward. So in some places, like Paramore, Hog Island, those are largely just eroding. You're losing island through time. You're losing area. Others, as you know, the whole island is moving. Wallops, you'll note, is net zero. Those numbers are in meters per year. So about 3 feet is 1 meter. So multiply any one of those by 3, and you get approximately how many feet per year, on average, each of those shorelines is moving, where the beach is moving. All the positive numbers, which all but fishermen's are positive, all those positive numbers mean that they're moving towards the land, as you can see in in the picture there, in those lines. Wallops isn't. On net, the southern end has moved, the northern end has grown, and of course it's harder. Fisherman's has grown, everything else has retreated. This is largely erosion. That's also what barrier islands like to do, which is migrate landward. If you extend this up to Assateague Island, you see the same thing, but not Chincoteague because it's protected. Unfortunately, if you were to map out some of its shorelines, particularly the marsh shoreline on the end, as you all know better than I do, it is moving, it is eroding. And that's where we're going to be kind of focusing in here. This is a very strange part of the Virginia barrier system. Outside of Fisherman's Island, northern Wallops and southern Assateague Islands are the only parts of this entire system that have been growing through time. Every other one of those islands has been eroding or moving. Largely those numbers I say per year, some of them were up to 30 or 40 feet per year, but it's not 1 year. It's things will grow, you know, you've been out to the beach, you know, they'll grow, they'll maybe not move for a long time, and then you get the big storm. And you'll get 100 feet in one night. That's what those numbers kind of mean. The opposite is happening here, where looking back to the 1800s, shown in the red line here, and then moving down through time, you've seen things like this before from me, as well, I'm sure, elsewhere, where Assateague Island has grown out in front of Chincoteague. Although here, it shows it, you know, at least from the 1800s, it largely was through time. Well, one of the motivating questions, one of the things you have to ask yourself when you look at a diagram like that is, if Assateague has has grown out in this way, and all Fishing Point is just less than, well, just around 100 years old, Fishing Point, Tom's Cove, the Hook, call it whatever you want, that area is just about 100 years old. What's going to happen in the next 100 years? And we suggest that there are two possibilities, kind of zooming out here a little bit. You can see now all of Wallops Island and you know, just the southern parts. We're kind of shifting our view to the south from that view. But we kind of feel like there's two real good possibilities. One, what's happened in the past continues to happen in the future. That would be the isthmus, and that would be Fishing Point today, and the whole thing continues to grow further and further. Eventually growing out in front of Wallops in the same way that Wallops, the very northern end, has grown today, thanks to a combination of beach nourishment projects, as well as what we call the refraction of wave boundary. Waves coming, largely our nor'easters here, do most of our work, cause most of our erosion. The hurricanes are just too rare to be all that important, even though they do a lot in a short time. The nor'easters that hit a dozen per year are largely what cause things to move from north to south. Winds waves come from the northeast to the south, dry sand that way. As those waves wrap around the hook, they kind of move in, and you're seeing this, I'm sure, bring pile of water up this way a little bit, even though the net wind direction is to the south. And that also has driven sand up there, allowed Wallops to grow wider through time, as well as, of course, adding a bunch of sand to the beach here, which also, because of those waves recurving, went north. Anywhere else along almost along the entire Virginia eastern shore, sand moves to the south. Period. And this is a different spot because of the way waves get wrapped around that. You'll note I drew here some little dashed lines. We're going to come back to those. I just want you to know this real quick. They're on southern Assateague, they're on Wallops, they're on that part of Assateague, and they're on Chincoteague. There's a lot we can learn about these islands just from that. So, thing one we think could happen is that the island continues to elongate and grow to the south, protecting not just Chincoteague from open ocean waves, protecting Wallops as well from open ocean waves. And the same way that Wallops has grown wider here, we would think that could happen further south. Not because of nourishment, not because of breakwaters, those aren't necessarily hurting the growth, or at least slowing the erosion, but because now the waves are working here, driving all that sand to the north. So that's one possibility. And of course, what this does is it takes Chincoteague Inlet from would be about here in this picture and moves it all the way down there. Sorry, it makes the path out to the ocean a little bit longer, but now those waves have a far, far distance to move, and you're really protected. How long is that? Well, we can look at the past rates and probably estimate something where it's down, the southern tip is down in front of the launch pads. You know, it's probably in the 100-year time frame. For a geologist, that's nothing. As a human, that's a long time. I won't be here to be proven wrong, so this is good. It's a beauty of geology. The other option, though, is that we have Tom's Cove Inlet, obviously, formed, right? So the isthmus breaches, and Tom's Cove Inlet forms, is what we're calling it. If you want to call it High Inlet, that's cool too. I'll accept it. And a new island as well forms south of that. Right? This would be the hook gets broken off. What happens? I don't know. Maybe it marches on. It's a big sandbar. Probably not. It's a pretty big chunk of land that probably remains as a second island with an inlet. And you know what? It's possible because it's happened before. We have evidence that back here there was a tidal inlet before, just pre-maps. And of course, we know further north on Assateague, there are places called Green Run Inlet, Sinnapunxet Inlet.
You had it right.
All right, thank you. So those are two inlets that were open and are shown on maps. Why not another one? All three of those that I mentioned closed. This one might, but it might not. Because at some point, if you're a little molecule of water and the tide's coming in, and you have to get from all the way out here, and you're going up to, on the rising tide to go fill Chincoteague Bay, that's a really far way to go. It's a lot faster to blow through an inlet up here, which is why some of those others form through time. And that's what we call, in our jargon, it's hydraulic efficiency. How efficient is it for water to move? And so this is a much more efficient pathway than down there, and certainly more efficient than that. So that's the other possibility. And of course, we know this could happen because there's evidence of it. We talked about the high camera before. This is Hendrickson's one of his photos. This is after Jonas in 2016, where, and as if I need to show this group, there's a bunch of breaches. However, every one of them healed. This did not take that tidal. We call it tidal prison, the volume of water moving through the inlet. It didn't become an inlet. It largely healed naturally. Sand moving along the shore refilled every one of those holes.
Does it have to be a continuous thing to keep it from healing?
Yeah.
I mean, at the same storm or whatever.
Right. It doesn't. You couldn't have a single storm that carves a hole and that just enough water keeps moving through that it keeps it open and continues to carve deeper and wider. That's largely how these things form. The most recent one that I can think of around these parts, Cedar Island, Southern Cedar, had what they called the breach, which was, of course, a breach in the island, and that was open for 15 years before it closed. And that's right near Wachapreague Inlet, which is a very deep inlet.
Any thought in your mind, which I'm glad it does close up, but why it does close up so quickly?
Yeah, here the answer is simply that longshore waves moving sand north to south, and it just fills the hole. None of these is very deep.
Okay.
But it's more than that. You have to look at, in fact, we've done this. We've collected a bunch of sediment cores back here, and as you all know, this is pretty shallow back there.
Mm-hmm.
It's also surprisingly muddy back there, and it's really tough for currents to carve. If this was deep water, I think that would be open already.
Okay.
The fact this is really shallow means it's very difficult for just currents to carve. That's today, where the inlet's not that far away. Thinking out 100 years, I start to question that.
So when it breaches and it pushes sand back in Tom's Cove,
Yep.
that further strengthens
Yes.
Tom's Cove,
Absolutely
right?
does. Yep.
From that breach.
Yep. And it gets everything. We notice is everything over here. Again, we had to go take cores. Probably could have just called somebody and asked. It's all very sandy on the backside there. And that's from exactly that. Wind waves and when it breaches, the currents bring in. We've got some great, I'm sure you've probably been out there and seen it, but I had my students out there right around this area one day during a storm and, just watching a river flow from the ocean into the cove.
They call
Carried
them
all that sand back there.
sand fans,
Yeah,
when
yeah.
they breached and they
Yep,
fan
yep.
out.
A fan is exactly, yep. And the term we would use is a washover fan, because, it's not terribly creative, it's washed over. Yeah. And the process we call overwash, and the fan is called a washover fan. I don't know. But yes, that's exactly, a fan. That is exactly, and that's what it looks like, a fan shape. Yep, you got it. So far, that's where we are. But that's where our eyes are, looking out into the horizon. Right? So you all know that the threats today are far more than that. So we've got, obviously, continued growth of the inlet, but it's more than just our growth efficient point, but it's more than that, it's growth of the inlet as well. So obviously comparing the 90s to 2016, that inlet has largely widened, and we're all well aware of the problems that have occurred there. You don't need a geologist to come in here and tell you that. But that reorientation has changed what we call the exposure. So you get a lot more wave energy in there now, because waves aren't always from the north. In fact, most days, 80%, 90% of the days, they're probably coming from the south around here. And now, they might not be big storm waves, except during a hurricane that can drive them to the north, but they are large enough to cause erosion. And you've all pointed out the evidence to me in the past of that area, where back in the 90s, as compared with, those are perfectly overlaying those images, as compared with the same, was it 2016 one I have up here, 2016 imagery, 1994 and 2016. So that's 22 years of change there. And that is simply because you're gone from very, very protected by the point to the point gets wiped out, probably largely pushed back up in here. And it's starved of sand because you're growing the southern end here. Sand keeps ending up here rather than making it as it used to all the way around into the inlet. So that's something to consider, and something we are considering when we talk about that. Whether it ever would make sense to think about a process of moving sand artificially from where it's getting stuck to help it get over to the old point and naturally grow. Now we're talking money there, of course, but it is one thing to think about. If it looked like that before, it could again. It's not that something's changed in the system that you need a much larger inlet now. It's that you just don't have any way to keep it closed, so waves knock it over. And it's largely, except for the thaw-way, the deep part of the channel, it's fairly shallow as far as I'm.
That was my next question. How deep is it right off of there? Like, if you go back over to 2016,
Yeah, like down here.
no, up just a little bit, right there. How deep is it right off of there?
Anybody know?
You know?
It varies. It goes from probably 10 feet to inches.
Yeah. We have some data
Yeah.
that show you. We actually have maps of that.
It's very
Up and down.
hilly,
Mhm.
yeah, what I call hilly, but
Yep.
it's,
They're old shoals. They're sand
They're
shoals.
shoals,
Yeah.
I've never seen more than 14 feet from my depth on
yeah. It gets 14 feet over in the channel, but closer to altitude, I mean, you can be going along and it's, you got plenty of depth underneath the keel, and all of a sudden, whoop, it comes right up and meets the bottom of the boat.
All right. So then the other thing, of course, is what's going on over at Wallops is another it's challenge, opportunity, threat. I don't know, whatever you want to call it, to Chincoteague and its inlet. Obviously the new breakwaters that have been built, and the dredging of the sand north of there that is altering the shape of the beach, which alters the shape of the inlet, which alters the wave energy coming in. And in addition to what's happening down further south, I think you're all familiar with the new dredge project that they're going to be doing for their dock, the little harbor on the backside of Wallops. And whether that will alter tidal currents and flows through this area. Also presents opportunities, because they have to dredge that channel, there's gonna be some sediment that is gonna be available for something. Something, and things to think about here. And those are things we wanna test.
We'll use it down the wall bed.
And of course, you know, I think you've probably seen, I've shown this before, it's one of my favorites, is, you know, watching this from the early eighties to the late teens and you'll notice, of course, you know, the isthmus is moving, although it's not, you see little breaches here and there, but every time you get one of those breaches, you are net moving sand a little bit further back. That's part of the process. That's how every island south of here is doing it as well. It's rolling over itself, it's migrating, and that's what's happening there. Okay, so this is kind of, you know, what you know, and you know, putting some of that change into perspective. Dark greens here are the earliest times in the early 1900s, and then going out to 2017, showing every shoreline year that we have a map or satellite image or aerial image for. Overlaying on that's a digital elevation map underneath it. So this kind of gives you a sense of how fast that has changed. One thing to note there, if you will, is take a look at some of these lines here, and you'll note that, you know, they kind of, in some ways, they almost follow the topography that's there. You get that little hill and swell, called ridge and swell. So if we take a look at a picture of fishing point, southern Assateague, you'll notice all, you know, you have your little hills of vegetation. Each one of those is an old shore. They all map out where shorelines were. So if we look here, we can actually trace the growth and change of Fishing Point by mapping out consecutive. So you walk from south to north. You're walking across the beach, but back through time. You're going back from today back to the early 1900s when that was the beach. We call these beach or dune ridges. Each one of them marks an old shoreline position. And the first thing that tells us about the work that we're going to be, or you know, where we're going. So I have this listed as SIMS. I think I forgot to mention the name of that somewhere. SIMS is the project we've been working on. We call it the Chincoteague Inlet Modeling Study because much like Washover, we're not terribly creative. And so Chincoteague Inlet Modeling Study is what we've been working on. And we want to get some perspective. We want to understand Chincoteague. We want to understand the likelihood of the breach happening. We want to understand the likelihood of wallops growing wider if Assateague continues to grow to the south. We have to understand the rates at which that has happened, how that has happened in the past. And for that, we rely on the geologic record. For that, we can rely on things like the ability to walk from the youngest beaches to the oldest beaches simply by mapping them out, just as I've done here. And what's very, very neat, I don't know if does that topography look like anything? I'll give you a hint, I just drove up to get here. Hopefully this gives you a new look at your own island. Look at all those ridges there.
That's amazing.
Every one of those is an old shoreline. We're sitting on one right here. Dig a hole anywhere on Chincoteague just about. Within a few feet, you're probably going to hit sand. Why? It's on an old beach. It's an old island that grew wider, much like Wallops is doing today in the same way. So the fact, that's our first hint, is the topography. Simple topography of Chincoteague. The fact that it matches what we can watch happening in the historic record in the last 100 years, or even in that video in the last 30 years. We just have to rewind further. And for that, we rely on the tools of geology, coastal geology. So this is what's going to give us our perspective here. So this is what we've been doing with this. The first stage of the project is, you know, we call it mapping the history of Chincoteague and Assateague to better predict the future of those two islands, to better understand what's coming up next. So we spent a lot of time doing that. You saw us out there, some of you. Remember Ellen driving around, watch us when we were we were geoprobing everywhere. Every dot on this map is some sort of sample you got. Everyone's a core. We went and collected sediment cores anywhere from 30 feet down to just about 90 feet down below the ground surface. Every one of those dots. The squares are where we did more and actually used our, it's called optically stimulated luminescence. It's a geochemical tool that we can use to date that beach and determine when it formed. I'm going to go through some of this. By the way, a lot of this, I put a thing here. I always want to share, although it's full of jargon, it's tough to get, I get it. I partially wrote it, I know how miserable it is. And I read this stuff all the time, it's my job, right? It's like, I can imagine trying to read something in legalese. It's just as bad as sciencese. But this is free and publicly available, and I'll give you a link later. And, you can find it on my website, search for it on the internet. You can download that and read the whole paper, the whole story of Chincoteague is written in that paper that my student, Justin Schaller, wrote, came out with just a few months ago. But what we did, actually that's Justin up there in the front of this group, our undergrads, we collected things like that. That's ground penetrating. Radar allows us to map what's in the subsurface without actually digging a hole. You can see, by sending radar into the below ground, you can see an old beach. This looks like it's a preserved beach. And there's another one in front of it as the beach grew out. There's another one in front of it. And as you walk this thing, you can actually map out how the beaches grew, the rate at which they grew. Then you want to go and see what's under there. So we went and collected sediment cores. This is one of our tools to do that. It's called a vibrocore system. It's on our landing craft slash coring boat. There's a moon hole in there. We were able to collect a chimney through the hull. We were able to collect these long cores. That's us collecting one. We also did this. That's a picture of us in Tom's Cove itself. You'll note that we're all wearing these. This is pretty early on in the pandemic. We were out there collecting the last of the cores. I forget what the name of this park is, but this is that core right there. That's us collecting that with our drill rig. We were around, this was now, I guess, 2 years ago, 2 summers ago?
That's Ridge Road, that's,
Tom's
yeah,
Cove.
Tom's Cove on this side, yeah.
Okay.
Barrett's
Barrett's.
door, yeah.
There's a camping spot or something?
Yeah, Tom's Cove camping,
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's it. That's I do.
there
So
you go.
you drill down right there in that spot?
Right there, yep.
Would you come up, or you gonna tell us what you come up
Sand.
with?
A lot of sand. Yeah. I will,
More
yep.
sand.
Yeah. I'm actually gonna skip a lot of the details of like, you can see we make these logs that have depth on one side and then type of grain size or, what we interpret it as. I'm gonna tell the story rather than give the details there. The details are in the paper though. You are absolutely welcome to those, and I'm happy to email it to anybody as well, if that's easier. That's a kind of a close-up elsewhere of us. I think that's on Paramore Island, but it's a good picture of our field team out there collecting some of these cores with this drill rig. This is the one that allows us to get down 80 feet plus if we want. And we're not, going for, water. We're just taking out the sediment and looking at it later in the lab and analyzing it. And months later, that's what grad students are for. We can start to put together a story. So same perspective, roughly the same perspective there, a little bit warped view of it. But you'll notice here, I've mapped out, the area. We have shorelines listed. So here's that 2017 shoreline. There's the 1887 shoreline. There's the 1859. And if you look back on the earliest maps, you can see the 1830 shoreline, matching about where the lighthouse is. That big ridge that the lighthouse is on.
So that beach has always been there, acetate?
Nope. Only since 1830.
So the beach was over towards,
It's about that big.
Lighthouse.
yeah, the lighthouse.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, the lighthouse ridge is an old dune ridge. There's a beach right underneath it. And that beach dates to the early 1800s.
That's what I've heard.
Yep. But we go further back. We're able to use our tools. Piney Island, 1600 AD. middle of Chincoteague Island, pretty much about the ridge we're standing on here, roughly. It's about 730 AD. And we call it, well, actually in our lab we always just call it West Ridge, both because it's the westernmost ridge and because Jim gave us permission to core on his property. So that date is from Jim West's property, but that is 250 BC. The westernmost part is the oldest part of Chincoteague. It's been there since 250 BC. So it's stepping me through what this looked like. It is Chincoteague, Assateague, Wallops today. This started as a series of barrier islands, just like Cedar Island, just like Wallops Island, migrating landward. That's what these are supposed to be. An island migrating over washing, yeah, landward to that position. Such that if we look back to around 2,500 years ago, 500 BC or so, we think the area looked something like that on the left. Same view. That's the same view of Chincoteague and Assateague and Wallops. This would be Assateague out here. That's Chincoteague. That's Wallops. I guess you call that Chincoteague Inlet. I don't know. Depends what you want to call it. There's an extra inlet there. And that's kind of what we have. So I've got my diagram on the right and my Photoshop on the left. And so we kind of have this little island. And that very narrow. Looks just like any of the other barrier islands to the south. Looks like Matamki, in fact. As does Wallops. And then through time, it starts to grow. It stops moving, stabilizes, starts to go a little wider. In the same way, in fact, that Wallops is. Why? Because you have Assateague out here, and waves are wrapping around, bringing sand over to Chincoteague. So, stepping through that, over time, Chincoteague grows, and Assateague gets a little bit longer. Till eventually, kind of looks something like that. This would be about the 1830 time frame. You now have Chincoteague, still fully vegetated, there's no development there yet. Assateague grown out in front of it. Wallops, still pretty narrow, not doing much over it. And it's very narrow. This would be about the time the lighthouse went in. Chincoteague looks like it does today. And then we could switch over to we don't have to use Photoshop, we can switch over to our historic maps. That's 1880, where Chincoteague now is fully covered, fronted by Assateague, but boy, it's a small island. It ends right there. Some sand shoals offshore. It looks something like that. And then it continues to grow. Eventually, you got the isthmus start to grow. And now you have the island looking like it does. So that's kind of the 2,500-year history. So what does this tell us about this area through time? One, the same way that we see these ridges grow out through time on Chincoteague, on southern Assateague, these are the same ridges that appear on Wallops. The same way that sand is wrapped around southern Assateague now to feed Wallops Island is the same way sand wrapped around to feed Chincoteague Island. So the fact that Chincoteague has this evidence of growth in this way, of Assateague building out in front of it, and the fact that that took approximately 1,000 years for Assateague to go from up here to down there, gives us a hint as to the timeline of this northern bit of Wallops is the northern part of Chincoteague Island, the twins, separated by 1,000 years. Maybe more, 1,500. Now, as this continues to grow, yes, Wallops could look a lot like Chincoteague in the future. It hasn't breached yet, although we know that there's one, that's one I pointed out before, inlets that have formed. They have not stayed forever. But, you know, in the lifetime of industry using the harbor here, 30 or 50 years, like some of these inlets stay open, it's going to feel like forever. So I'm not sure I want to hang my hat on that yet. So one of the things we're going to do here, is we want to test what happens if this breaches. What happens if you get an inlet form there? How stable is that? What does it mean for wave energy reaching Chincoteague Island? What does it mean for currents going through here? Will this inlet close? What will happen out here? Where are the waves going to be? Where are the tides going to be? What's the currents going to be? How's it going to change something like tidal range? It's a lot easier to get water in there if that breaches. We know this is possible. What about the other situation if this thing continues to grow? So in order to test these longer term questions, as well as to test these really management scale questions, like what to do about erosion of the marsh in the southern end of Chincoteague, we rely on the Sims model. So that is now stage 2. We're going to, or we have at this point, built the model, the Chincoteague and the modeling study model, right? The Sims model, as we just call it, right? What is a model? What do I mean by that? There's many different terms, there's many different types of models out there. This specifically is a hydrodynamic sediment transport model. That is, it simulates how waves, currents, and tides move and act, and how those act to move sediment, sand, mud in the system. That's what, and this specific model is called Delft 3D, made by friends over in Delft, in the Netherlands. That's why it has that name, the original model. But that's just the framework. It's a bunch of equations. What you need to do is need to build that for a specific location. You could do this for nowhere. You could just make it up as though you're on Mars. Doesn't matter. If you want to answer questions about a specific area, you have to build your model to that area. And what that means is that waves don't just act on nothing. Waves are influenced by what's happening offshore. Waves are influenced by how deep the water is. In fact, as you know, standing on the beach, a wave 200 feet offshore looks very different than it does right before it crashes, right? And that's all driven by the depth, the water depth. There's nothing more than that. But if I want to predict how that wave is going to hit me standing on the beach, or how big the run-up is going to be, I need to know the depth right there, but I need to know it offshore too. And I need to know at every place in between in order to predict, using the numerical equations in the model, exactly what that wave is going to look like. That's what this does. So step 1 here is to develop the depths, the grid, as we call it. The grid is, that's a zoom out of it. I'll talk about what those numbers mean in just a second. Zoom into that area. I'd say, go back to the numbers just so you know. This is kind of how far out it goes. Just some numbers and how far offshore and how zoomed in you are. Basically, that's our area of our grid. The little cutouts are where we're going to go into higher resolution. Basically, if the wave's out here in a few hundred feet of water, you don't really need to know exactly if the depth is different from me to you. But maybe from here we can go to the building across the street and that's close enough. The water depth's pretty deep, doesn't really matter. But once we get up close to the inlet, man, it matters. We need to get a lot closer. So that's what our resolution is. It's fairly small, between about 150 feet between our cells. So it's basically, I know the depth here, I know the depth 150 feet that way, 150 feet that way, and that way. Offshore, it's a lot more. It's falls right to 600 feet. That's the idea, all right? And that's the area that this covers. And so zooming in, this is what the grid actually looks like that we're building. This is what I mean. It looks like a grid, right? These are our low resolution cells, and they get higher and higher resolution as we zoom into this area. We kind of merge them together. So that every one of these little squares you see there, we know the depth in that exact location, or elevation in that exact location. And offshore as well. Which means we had to do a lot of mapping to get there. So in order to do this, we all have available to us ways to know the depth. We have charts, NOAA charts, like this one. And they have a lot better than charts. They actually have data sets that you could download that have things mapped out in higher resolution in a chart. For example, This is some of the NOAA data that was collected in 2015 around the inlet. This is additional data that we've collected on top of it. I'm going to show this again. But the colors here, blues, in both cases are deeper water. The reds are shallower water in all cases, right? You'll recognize the channels there. This is a lot higher resolution than any chart. Because you can't even see the cells there. You can't see, you can kind of get some of this idea of the spacing out here. You can see some of our track lines where the boat went. But you can't even see the size of the cells. So we know exactly the depth. As the data was collected, I recognize it's different. I know this area. It was different the next day. I get it. But we have to start somewhere. And we can compare. We rerun the same areas a few times and gives us a better sense. So that's some of our data there. And so just to try to put this together, this is all looking at the same area. You'll recognize where we're looking better in a minute, but these are the two, we call it kind of a double barrel channel of the inlet. There's the main western channel that goes right along Wallops, and there's the eastern channel. I've been stuck in a lot of places. Same area. I'm not changing where we're zoomed in. So this is from NOAA, their high resolution mapping that they had done in 2015. So we start with our NOAA chart. We layer on NOAA's mapping from 2015 in high res of the inlet. We layer on top of that, that's UD2, that's University of Delaware, that they collected in 2019. That's our partners. So you can see where they went. You could, the hook is pretty well outlined there. And by the way, you can get a sense of, the yellows here are deeper water, the blues are shallower water. That's, going back, that is Udell in 19. Udell went back in 20, and you see they have some overlap in this area, so we can compare one year to the next and get a sense of how fast it's changing. But then we combine it all those data sets, the NOAA charts, the NOAA 2015, the Udell 2019, the Udell 2020, and we get our fine scale grid, and we can put it all together. And that's probably the best resolution. When you map that out with the topography on top, that is our current grid right there. I hope you can recognize all the features there as well. Obviously, reds are real high, very light greens, and going to blues are your deepest water. And we've talked about this with some folks. This is it's modestly updated, but we still have more work to do on it. Chatting about some of the issues that this has, particularly around the harbor. There's obviously no jump there. So once you start to stare at it, you can see some little issues that we're still sorting out as we get better at this. As we improve it and collect more data as we need to. But you can see a lot of effort. And if you've ever just run track lines, we call it mowing the lawn because it's that exciting. Where you just run along one direction, drag an instrument, you turn around, and you come back about 50 feet east of where you were. You go back and do it again. And that's how we map out the bottom. It's very, very time consuming and vessel time consuming. But this is where a lot of the effort goes. Because if you don't have the right bathymetry, you're not going to get the right model. Garbage in, garbage out, as we say in modeling world, right? And we don't want to start with garbage. We want to start with the best we can.
Chris, let me show you.
Yeah.
Slow you up for a little bit.
Yeah.
Looking at the map on the right,
Yep.
where, and you know them personally because you've been up on them, the sandbars there in Tom's Cove that close off the mouth of Tom's Cove
Yeah, these over there.
from the west. Yeah, those. If the isthmus were to breach,
Yep.
they look like they would be a stopgap from a deep channel forming there to impact Chincoteague, to me, because they're so shallow.
Yep, you're absolutely right for a period of time at least. So
Yeah.
they are sand, which means that
They could
unlike the
move.
big dense muds, they are movable. Yep, they can move. So if you were to have an inlet here, just like when you opened up this inlet, those waves are gonna start coming right in there, and they're probably gonna chop it off, pretty quickly, is my guess. But yeah, as of right here, it would be like sitting on a beach with a sandbar offshore, and just watching the waves break out there and nothing striking the beach. That's exactly how that would work for a period of time. And maybe long enough. But yep, that's a huge benefit that this piece of acetate breaking off and basically forming that has provided an extra buffer. Absolutely. But that's one of the things that we're going to be able to test in the model. We're going to blow a hole in the model right here, and we are going to see what wave energy looks like there, and what's the, and because we have sediment transport within this, that is, we know how sand is going to move under those wave conditions, we're going to see how stable that is. That's exactly the kind of thing that we can do in a model that we're otherwise just kind of pointing and guessing.
Right.
I do a lot of pointing and guessing. I'm not a model, I'm a geologist. So that's exactly right. Yep. So that's the big component. That basically took us, well, we were doing other things simultaneously, all of our field data, trying to get the big geologic history. So you saw us out here doing that early because we could. But that's, that's 2 years of mapping and grid building and data collection from all these different sources. There's more. This grid, remember the big scale grid, it's all of Chincoteague Bay. So we needed to collect and make sure. And then, every time you take 2 data sets and put them together, I guarantee you end up with a waterfall. That is, one seems to sit 10 feet higher than the next. And you're like, well, that's not real. There's no cliff out there underwater. So what's going on in the middle of Chincoteague Bay? So now it's sorting it out, which one's right, and so it's just very, very, it's a time-consuming process. But, thankfully, our team in New Orleans, Yamas's team, they like doing it. So, good. I don't know. All right, the next thing, though, is that, okay, great. We know what the bathymetry is like. If we want to understand how waves are attacking the shoreline, we have to understand what kind of waves and tides and whatnot conditions there are. So we went out, and you can start, just like I did with NOAA, you can start with available data. This, I literally pulled that today. That's the, that's your tides, right, for here. But that's not enough. That's one location. And remember where our grid covers, we need to know a lot of locations in order to get the model right. We call it calibrating the model. Making sure it's tweaked just right, that we're able to reproduce waves exactly as they are in real life, that everything's working. So that's good for that location. But beyond that, we go out and we dumped a bunch of these things. By the way, we're missing one. So if anybody hears of something coming up, give me a call, please. These are tri or quadrupods, big weights down there, steel weights or lead weights, and then a whole bunch of instruments to measure waves. This goes on the bottom and sits there for a month, 2 months, and you're measuring. You can see this little one here with the red eyes. It looks like that's just an instrument like this, and what that is it's sending signal. In this case, it's a sound signal up through the water column, and from that, it can actually map the waves that are going over. It's got pressure sensors. It knows the tides. It's mapping currents, water flow through the water. It uses the Doppler effect, the same thing that when a police car goes by, it goes woo, right? That change in velocity as something goes by, that change in pitch as it goes by. Same thing happens as a little, as a little plankton goes by, being carried by the current, and it can measure that. They're called redshift. So we did a bunch of these. University of Delaware led this effort in and out of the harbor here, and they were able to collect data like this, for example. And the dates here, we are in July. This is 19, I believe, although I have it on a future slide, I was positive it's 19. And here you have basic thing, temperature, water temperature. It's in Celsius, I don't even know what it means. Salinity. Interesting, you're watching the salinity drop at that location. This is a location basically in the inlet, by the way. This is from one that we put out in the inlet itself. Turbidity, how much stuff's in the water? How much sediment's being carried in the water? Big waves, you get more material suspended, you get higher turbidity measurements. You can also go beyond that. This is HS, that means significant wave height. How big are the waves? significant wave heights technically, the height of the 1/3 largest waves. So you take all your waves that occur over a period of a few hours and rank them by height, you go up to basically 2/3, the highest waves there. So better than half. That's what you're looking at there.
So it looks like July 10th, there was some sort of
Yep.
storm.
Yep, exactly. It's exactly how you read that. Bingo. You've got wave period here, how frequently are the waves hit. And if you'll notice that same thing, you get long period waves, like a storm wave, the big swells coming. And then this is UV is in meters per, that is bottom current velocity. How fast is water moving at that point? And you notice, boy, things are going on there quite a bit. Yep. If positioned in the right place, that's right tidal, you'll see a tidal signal in that last one. Where as the tides, the high tide and low tide, slack tide, there's no water movement. But then mid tide, you'll see, it goes real high during mid tide, and then real high during falling tide. Same kind of right here. And yes, we did act also, yeah, there you go. I'm sorry, it was 2020, not 19. Yep. Yep, it was Tropical Storm Faye that went through there. This is a site here. This is called the Shields parameter. It's just a fancy way of saying how strong, how capable are the waves plus currents to move sand. A higher Shields parameter means it's easier, it's more friction on the bottom. You can pick up sand and move it easier. That's all it means. Big idea here. A lot of sand. Big storm. Well, modestly big storm. It was Tropical Storm Faye. I don't think it's going in the record books. No idea. But we did capture it, which is just a luck. And what was less lucky was the tripod that's still in the inlet. Probably buried by a sandbar that moved over it, you think. Next step. Now we have all this input data. We know what happens in real life. Now let's force it in the model and compare. Can the model reproduce what we see? A lot going on here, but let me just point out basically what we're trying to get at. This is water depth. This the wheels, that's your tidal sector. In blue, in all of these, okay, that's tide, basically water depth. This is your waves. This is your period of the wave, wave height, wave period. This is for that location right out there. You'll notice how many spots we have. Those are all of our locations where we put out these things. So we can compare. So in the model, we say, all right, tell me, extract the waves and the tides at that location, at these coordinates. Then we have our tripod we put out there, and we compare the data for that day that we're simulating in the model. The blue is what we actually saw, and the green is our simulation. It's not 100% perfect, but in modeling world, this is really good. You get this big event here, this big wave event there. Whenever they match, that's what you're looking for. Whenever the green and blue are on top of each other, that's what we're looking for. Really good with water depth and the tides. Pretty good, really good with the period. The wave height, we notice that we're at that location, the model in green seems to think that in general, waves should be a little bit higher than what we actually observe. This is all part of the game. This is how you build these things. Finally, now we have a model that we know the bathymetry, and we can simulate what waves are doing anywhere in any grid, in any location in this area. We can simulate tides, we can simulate currents, we got it all. Good. Now, let's layer on one last thing, which is, what's all that doing besides causing waves and erosion? We can simulate sediment. So again, we go to what's out there. This is a bunch of samples that go the entire eastern shore, all offshore, and this is colored by grain size. The dark browns are medium sand, the tan is very fine sand. So we know where different sand types are. But just like our grid, it's good to know regionally, we really care about what's local. So we go into the grain sizes in Chincoteague Bay. So here, the yellows are a lot sandier, near the island, for example, and up near the mainland, it's a lot less percent sand. So different way of looking at it. These are all from different publications that predate this project. But then finally, we go out and, of course, collect our own samples, because This is great for the southern region, that's great for Chincoteague Bay. We really want to know what kind of sediments in this area are moving things around. So we've gone out with a Ponar grab sampler and collected, I don't even remember how many samples, I'll show you, there's the map of all the samples that we collected and analyzed in our lab for grain size. The number there, that is the median grain size, effectively almost like the average grain size, in millimeters, in color code. Quite a lot going on there. But you can basically see the dark reds, that's where you have the coarsest material, sand. And then your clays or silts are in white. So again, if we look at Tom's Cove, well, you can see the channel there, it's very sandy, you can really see that popping out. You can see, the cove itself is very muddy, except up near the backside of the isthmus where you do have that sand coming in, as we discussed before. So those are just a few things. And then, we kind of played around trying to grid this out, what this might look like. I didn't crop out the islands, but you kind of get a sense of finer stuff there, coarser material, coarser sand up through the main channel of the inlet, and some random spots that don't make a lot of sense to us. It seems a little bit coarser, like that one. Everything's also fine. So that's what we have. So now we have sediment that we can put in the model. So let's check out what this does. Let's give you some examples. Would you mind just clicking on just anywhere on the image, I think it should go? So this is flow velocity. This is the current. How fast is the current moving? It says meters per second, I don't have to worry about that. The bigger the arrow, the faster it's moving. The arrow points in the direction that the currents are moving. What are you looking at? Largely tides. A lot of arrows going in, flooding tide, and they're going to turn and go back out, ebbing tide. And this is all calibrated to what we actually measure. This represents reality. Every point in our grid, we have an arrow that tells us at that exact moment that we're simulating which way the currents are going, cardinal, and in any direction. It's not just in or out, it's any direction on the compass, and what their velocity is. The bigger the arrow, the faster is the way to do it. You can really see how the currents, especially, you could stare at these things forever. The ebb currents really come ripping through that eastern channel, whereas the flood currents seem to do a little bit more with the western channel there, or go over the entire inlet. When you look at it coming out there, they're really big there. This is actually quite a bit of current being carried in that little channel over to NASA's new harbor. And of course, we can also start to see, does that make sense based on what we know? You get pretty similar currents going right along the west side of Chincoteague as you do up in the other, I don't know the name of that channel.
Queenstown.
Thank you. I love that I could do that, just get an answer right. So these are the kinds of things we can look at. Currents are neat. Well, let's go to the next one. Because this is waves, and so this also has a bit of color on here as well. So, the big thing here is look towards where we get when we have a storm that comes through partway through the simulation. There's the point, there's the inlet, that Chincoteague. Wallace is down here, it's a little dark here. But again, you're looking at wave height here. This is the strength of waves, where we use arrows to show us the direction of the waves. This is the important one, this is what's causing erosion. And then the height is shown also in color. So you're going to get a sense. And watch this go. So same thing if you want mine. So all right, not much. Notice waves are largely coming from the south there. Right? You see which way the arrows are pointing to the north, which means the waves are coming from the south. Yeah. And then, you can see some, you can notice here, you have this weird pattern where they're kind of that way, but there's a little oriented in a different way once those waves move around the ebb delta, the inlet. Not much, very small waves, not much of anything in the backside there. But we will get hit with the storm here pretty soon. And I want you to kind of keep an eye on the isthmus area as that happens. All right, here we go. Whoop, something's building. Something's building. And that's actually, I think, from the, clearly it's waves from the south. It's not a nor'easter that we're simulating in this one. But, you can see where those wave heights are getting real big along there. you know, where, and how well protected this area generally is. Now this is, again, just a sample, and it's not, doesn't give us the high resolution grading here, but this is the kind of thing now that as we move into the final phase of the project, we're gonna be looking at areas right there, you know, right where we have all the erosion. And when we blow a hole through here, or allow the inlet to grow, or the isthmus to grow longer, then we could play this game again and see, all right, where's the wave energy? If we're going to do things like, for example, let's go back to, yeah, this is a good diagram. We're going to put in here and here, we're going to try in the model hardening those shorelines, saying you can't erode this. What kind of structure would be needed? Let me reverse that. We're going to answer the question, what kind of wave energy is possible there? Therefore, what size of a structure do we need to build? What would actually work to protect it? That's what we're doing in an area like that. We're going to carve the new channel back here in the model and see how does that change waves and currents. Same. Those are the things that we can do now, or that we're already doing now. The first ones we're already working on to slow the process, but because we have to change the grid. And anytime you mess with the grid, it's a mess. We have the model working, now we're tweaking elevations in the grid. You just literally go in there and almost like with your mouse paint it and change the elevation. But it's a slow process because you don't want cliffs and waterfalls. So that gets us to basically where we are today that I want to update you on, where we've been able to tell the story of Chincoteague and Assateague and Wallops and put the current situation, the current environment, the current geography, and the current threats into perspective to give us a sense of what's the timeline here of change, what's the timeline at which we need to maybe be worrying about the large-scale change. Then we spent most of our time here deploying instruments, collecting wave current data, building a grid, and putting it all together to accurately model today. And now the next thing is our next goal is we're testing, this is going to happen throughout this fall. We've been slowed down. I don't know if you heard, our colleagues down in New Orleans were living in hotels for 2 weeks, so we just lost the last 2 weeks of time. They still don't have power. Giannis was trying to give me a slide yesterday, and his internet's like, I think he's using his cellular signal Wi-Fi to upload things from his house. It's a mess. Nonetheless, they're okay, and everything's slowly building momentum again. But throughout the rest of the fall, I think probably into early winter, we'll be doing effectively 1, 2, 3. Hardening of southern Chincoteague, testing that if we were to put breakwaters off that eroding marsh, for example. What to do with the Wallops channel dredging and other ideas. I threw in there this idea of this inlet bypass. That is taking sand from the very southern tip and maybe moving it. So let's build out the tip a little bit artificially in the model, the old fishing point, and see what happens. Is that just unstable? It's just going to be whacked and wiped out by waves again. That's the kind of thing we can answer or try to answer. Again, it's a model. It's an experiment. It's a way to test things. It's not. It's not a life or death kind of answer. Although I know that some of the implications are massive around here. But remember, it is a tool. So I don't want to overpromise what those things will tell us. But they're going to give us a lot of information to help plan best approaches. And then finally, probably in the spring, we're thinking kind of, because it's less important, frankly. We don't need to worry about 100 years from now. This month, we need to worry about it and start to plan for it. So we are going to, before the project's over, kind of play with these other alterations, like growing Assateague longer or changing that new unit, adding that new unit. So that's kind of where we are today with it. So I leave up here, I think, I know you all probably have my contact information, but it's there again. I do want to, of course, recognize the Sims team. Mike's had the opportunity to meet Giannis, our lead modeler. He's with Water Student Gulf, used to be at the University of New Orleans, so has an affiliation there. And he's got a big team working on this. There's probably, at any given time, there's 10 of them that are, you know, they have many projects, but anyone of 10 are spending time on this, including 2 people dedicated full time to especially the green development. Art and his student Katie, who've been doing all of our work at Dell, all the instrument deployments and mapping. Mike, who was in charge of our grain size. My team, of course, did all the geological work and the grain size analysis for Mike. And then, so all of our students and everything are worth noting there. And then, I'm not going to use QR codes, but I always like to do this. If you want, you know, you could take a picture, and that will get you right to the website of that paper that I talked about, the one from that tells the story, the history of Chincoteague Island. There's one figure that, even if you ignore all the rest of the stuff, there's one figure that I showed up here that goes through, you can actually watch it change, you know, in the static living figure, which is kind of nice.
And Chris, we emailed that, all the council, when you
Perfect.
sent it to me, we
Good.
emailed it out to them,
Perfect,
so.
great, you don't need
A
that.
lot of
really.
reading in it. It's interesting. I haven't got all the way through it, but I'm beginning.
It's a lot of
It's
description.
a lot.
Yep, this unit is this grain size sand and has this, yep, oh, I
Yes.
know.
I'm going,
Yep.
okay, all right.
Yep. Yep, it's a full-time job, so you could spend a lot of time doing that. But yeah, that, I hope you enjoyed it. If nothing else, there's one figure in there you put in that I think is, I love the idea that you can learn your home,
Yeah.
how it formed. And that I hope tells that. That was one of our goals there. So anyway, good, you don't need to worry with the QR code. Excellent. So that's where we are.
Cool.
Amazing. I mean, it's just amazing to see this. I mean, I don't have a clue as to how you all do what you do, but when you bring it up here and you show it like this, it's just amazing to the technology and the science behind it all. Just
Are you familiar with public land in Merlin?
No.
It's on the back side of Assateague.
Okay.
It's before you get to Centipux Bay.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, I was told at Public Landing, all there was the beach. About a mile or 2 miles to the mainland, the beach. It's a bay.
Yeah. I'd have to
You know
look.
where Greenbackville is, right?
Yep, I do. Yeah, I know where that is.
Okay,
Yep.
you keep going north, right on Greenbackville,
Yeah.
on up to Girdle Tree, and along on that back side. But
Okay.
Spence, it's Spence, Public
Yeah.
Landing, the bay.
Yeah.
That's what I've been told was all beach.
I believe it. You know, it's, you get, when you start to go deeper back, you find things like, Mockhorn Island, if you know where that is. That's an old barrier island that's 40 to 50,000 years old. And I know that similar features exist. Though I haven't worked really north of here, I can't stop. You know, Virginia's in the sun.
I know, I get that. But it's
So,
not very far up the road. I mean,
Yeah.
you're talking about Green Run.
Yep,
Okay,
that's true.
it's just a little north of Green
All
Run,
right. Yeah, no,
to the west.
to the west. Yeah, so I absolutely, there wouldn't surprise me one bit.
Yeah.
But I don't know for sure, and I couldn't speak to it.
Right.
Did your sediment samples, did they tell you anything about the timeline? So if you got that sediment built out on Assateague and Wallops, is that sediment that you collected during the borings, does that match the sediment on Chincoteague? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, actually, we absolutely, in fact, that's exactly what we're doing next. Or, you know, it's one of my students' things that is kind of unrelated to this, but we are comparing, say, the sediment on Fishing Point, on southern
Right, that's
Assateague,
what I was saying.
to that on Chincoteague. Because, so here's the thing, you know, if you go to a beach, say after a storm, you might notice it's a little bit coarser. What happens is those big waves, they move the fine sediment offshore. So there's this relationship. The higher the wave energy, the stronger the waves, the coarser the beach. Well, Chincoteague grew out in a condition where it was facing the open ocean to the east, versus Assateague is growing out and it's facing it to the south. Those are very different wave energies there. And the big waves, the nor'easters, really don't strike southern Assateague. So we'd expect Assateague would maybe be a little bit finer sand than Chincoteague. So this is the kind of thing we're exploring now, going back through time vertically in the course and across the beaches to look at how maybe wave energy has changed throughout this time in different areas. And whether, even just in the last 100 years, we see a noticeable change in, and that could be because storms have gotten bigger. Maybe they have. I don't know. Maybe they've gotten more frequent around here. I'm not convinced. But that would alter the grain size, the sediment that we find, and that could tell us a lot about the kind of history of the area and how it's been impacted by these same coastal processes. So it is, and go back 2,000 years and do the same thing. That's one of the things we're trying to do.
When you were getting your core samples, digging down, your sediment samples, going down 80 feet, might be a dumb question, not sure. Were you getting anything else besides sand and soil and?
It's sediment in general,
Yeah.
but I'll tell you. So I'll just use. I'll give you two examples that I find are pretty. If you go out to Fishing Point, that's kind of an easy one. Fishing Point is, and we took a bunch of cores down the beach. We drove that little drill rig on the way down the beach. It was a long day. The thing goes about 1 mile an hour, right? And we took core, we jump in, take cores, and go down. So as we did that, every one of those cores showed the same thing. Down deep, you get down 60 feet. It's fine sand, real fine. And what it is you're looking at there is a kind of sediment that you'd expect to find way offshore. Why? Because that area that's now underneath the island was way offshore. And then as you go up in the core, it gets a little coarser and coarser. So, maybe by 30 feet, you're looking at something like you find in, 30 feet of water at that. 20 feet, it's almost identical to the sand you find 20 feet of water. And then by the time you get up to the beach, it looks just like the mountain beach. So it gets coarser, in geology we call it, yes? And a creative coarsening upward sequence. That is, it gets coarser as you go up. And that tells us what we already know from the imagery, which is if this thing built out and where the point is today, where that entire thing is today, used to be deeper water. And that is recorded in the sediment. So that's neat. You could do that in an area you know. Now let's take it over to Chincoteague. What we see here, this is still a bit different. Here, every core, if you go from the west to the east, across the island, you actually find, we call it layer cake, like a layer cake. It is pretty flat. It's the same units in every core. And here's what they look like. Down at the base of every core, you have to go down maybe 70, 80 feet. You're going to find gravel. Maybe the old river, the old Susquehanna River is running. You've maybe heard of this gravel that's at depth around you. You'll find it. But one of the reasons Chincoteague Inlet is where it is because there's no river channel. And then there's upland. Basically, this area, when sea level was much lower, looked exactly like the mainland Delmarva. Sea level, beaches, shrines, way, way out there. This whole area was just an extension of the mainland. So we hit that. We hit basically old soil at depth. It's thousands of years old. Okay, now you're coming up. And all of a sudden it transitions very hard to mud. And it's I forget, maybe 20 feet of mud. 20 feet of mud is like Chincoteague Bay. So you're looking at, as this island was moving landward, there was a bay behind it. There was mud being deposited. And it's still down there. The island stops and then builds out back over that mud from west to east over that 1,000-year period. And so now you have this package of sand sitting on top. So it's upland, mud, and then old beach. And that beach is, I want to say it was 6 yards, so about 20 feet thick everywhere. The sand, ballpark, 15 to 25, kind of that range is how thick that sand is. And then bam, mud right underneath it. From the old lagoon, when Chincoteague Bay was wider, before Chincoteague made it all the way here. So yeah, we can tell a lot. That's how I can tell that story there, and that's what the stratigraphy, we call stratigraphy, what the sediment layers are underneath us. And right here, you can do the same thing. And one of our cores was, what's the road right there?
People.
Hollywood.
Okay, yeah, that one, yeah. Right, so we took one, it was right over there, right by that little bike path. We parked the rig. So, and that's, like I said, it's one of the places we did. We actually took one of our cores that we use for dating. I told you we were sitting on a ridge that was about 750 years old here. That was taken right on the back, kind of where the parking lot goes, ridge right there, right at the edge of the woods right there. That's what we dug down about 3 feet into the ground and popped a bit of sand out, and we were able to send that off for dating. And that's how we know exactly how old where we're standing. It's 750 AD, I think was this one. Maybe that was, or maybe it was, this was closer to 200 AD. It was one of those. It's in the paper. But yeah, that's, so yeah, and it's the same story everywhere. It was really quite a fun one to uncover, to unravel as we did it.
All right, so I've got a kind of an oddball question. The beaches to our north, from Long Island all the way down,
Yeah.
are pumping sand up from the ocean.
Yep.
The sediment that they're pumping from offshore, I would think would be finer sand, correct? Or would that be coarser sand?
So there's a lot of, generally we think the deeper water, the finer the sand. And so I would agree. What they do is they try to find these sand shoals.
Yeah.
If you ever look at, I have to go way back here, but I'll do it as we go.
I'm just thinking if, because most of our sand arrives by way of the longshore current, and it's picking up this sand from up north, that's gonna change the type of sand that we have on the island.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. Okay, so first on the nourishment question. You know that there's all these shoals offshore? Generally, those tend to be a little bit shallower, so they tend to be a little bit coarser sand. So they will, which is exactly what Wallops did as well when they nourished, well, the first time, not when they
First
still
time,
in the
yeah.
beach. Then you go to one of those shoals and basically cut the top off one of those shoals. And that's what they do. So they try to match it. People are pretty, this is New Jersey we're talking about. People are pretty particular about their sand. Nobody wants darker sand with all the heavy minerals in it, like you find on the beach after a storm, because it's hot, burns your feet. They don't want coarser sand, because that hurts your feet. They don't want finer sand, because it sticks more and squeaks when you walk on it. They don't want shells in the sand, because that hurts your feet. Right? So actually, there's like a whole industry built around trying to find exactly the right sand and match it to the beach to make people enjoy it, like it's their natural beach. So these are all the considerations for that. Now, you're absolutely right. Okay, so ice sand, grain of sand, gets picked up by waves and slammed down by the next wave. What's happened to that little grain of sand?
It's small.
It's small, yeah, it gets beat up, gets smaller and smaller. There's a trend here where you go from the north, Delaware, which is where a lot of our sand is from here, to the south, all the way to it's Fisherman's Island. Sand gets finer and finer as you go. So what we have here in Estes is finer than what you find on sea level, for example. Is coarser than what you find on sea level.
Good.
Yep. So that's evidence of how far this goes. And yes, when they nourish Ocean City, when they nourish, probably that's about it. I don't know if they do like Rehoboth, Bethany Beach like that, maybe. Ocean City, definitely. I am sure that some of the reason this thing is growing, some of that sand comes from Ocean City and probably a bit from the nourishment of Ocean City. Because it doesn't stay there, there are reasons to re-nourish it. Yep. Likewise, this comes from the nourishment in part, not all. When we did the math on this, it's actually in that paper as well, that was the second half. So you write these papers, to tell the story, but then you always have to look, I know this is going to be a surprise, there's only so many people who care, right, about Shinketeek. We are among them, but we are giving this to scientists globally, right? So it's like, all right, how do we make Shinketeeks very exciting and interesting to others? And the thing that we found that was really fascinating was how fast it's grew up. How much sand in 2,000 years got stuck here, here, and here. And it's enormous volumes of sand that came south from Delaware and never made it past here because it built these islands instead. And so one of the questions that we attack in this paper is, are all the islands to the south, the first diagram I showed, are they moving and eroding so quickly, in part because they're not getting enough sand because it's all staying up here? And the answer is absolutely. So the same way that we might be getting excess sand from the nourishment, it's staying here, it's built this out. There is more sand in these 3 islands than in every single island south of Wallops combined. So that is a major reason that those islands are eroding. It's entirely natural.
So hopefully we won't float away.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. Although if you do, and if this gets eroded and wiped out, that's all that sand's going. The Nature Conservancy is partying that. So, but that's that's not going to happen. But that is the kind of scale and the kind of thing that we're thinking about, and how what happens here doesn't stay here. It affects every island to the south. The same way that the nourishment, what happens up there, affects here to some degree. It's not going on to Chincoteague anymore, that's pretty good, but it is probably going into the inlet forming those shoals. And you probably can see evidence of it, but we haven't looked for it there in the nourishment side. One thing we did do in that paper as well, we kind of took the volumes, how much sand did they add? How much sand did they add at Wallops? And I will say that they're still really small, 10% of the total sand trapped even here. So even if all that sand ended up trapped in the system, it still only accounts for a small bit of the total sand. So this did not grow because of nourishment. It added to it, but only a little bit of the margins. Mostly it's a totally natural process.
Well, Dr. Hahn, I've been through a couple of
talks, and it gets more interesting every time I hear it. It's phenomenal.
Thank you. Hopefully, I'm happy. Look, the next goal, I think the next thing is we have to, this is us. We've kind of done the quiet work. It was convenient. It was during the pandemic. But now I think it's time to make sure that what we're doing in these next stages, we're using this to the best good that we can for you all. As I've said to Mike, you guys are our client in this case. So I've told you the management things we're thinking about based on what I've heard, but we're listening, and I want to hear also what you're all thinking, and it doesn't need to be right now, obviously, but we're around and always game for another meeting to discuss this and how we can use the model to test different management strategies, see what would be effective, and inform maybe construction, inform projects that would beneficial use of dredge material or shoreline hardening projects. These are the kinds of things that any engineering company or federal engineering body, the Army Corps, would use a model to, like this, to test so that they can design properly. I don't know if you sent around the Chincoteague, the Cedar Island paper, but our next step of that, we've now designed a little marsh restoration project there. Our next step, we have a meeting actually next week to work with Stantec. They're going to be doing a very, very miniature version of this, 5%, 10% for just the area right around Watchapuri Inlet. So we can test that. Why? We'll not get it permitted without the modeling. And we're going to be using the same tools.
Anybody have any questions?
Very interesting.
Amazing, yeah, just amazing.
Happy to share
Thank you
that.
so much.
Yeah.
And we look forward to everything that you do. See how the models work.
And the other thing is, so there's, I think like there's two, that's the big one, hands down. The other offer is, if you ever want, I don't know what you have, give a talk over at the museum. I'm happy to do this if you want more, a town-sponsored thing that might attract a larger audience, and just stick to kind of the history of the island and tell that a little bit more, kind of like I did last time. This island and put it in the context of some of the others. That's always a fun thing to do.
I think a lot of people would enjoy this, but
Oh, yeah.
the museum is not big enough. We would
No,
have to
no,
have
it's
it
not.
across here at the
Happy to
center.
do it there. It's great
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
I've been showing off the picture of the taxidermy Misty to everybody.
I didn't even realize you were gonna be at the museum
Yeah.
until it was over.
Yeah.
So, but I'm happy to do it for, yeah, at a larger place, yeah, for sure. Yeah,
Thank you so much.
yeah,
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
Alrighty, I'm just gonna put it out there. Does anybody have anything they would like to comment on? Billy? Anything?
He messaged me,
Oh, he's gone.
he got cut off.
Oh,
He's gonna call back in when we get to the next.
okay. Does anybody have anything?
No, sir.
Alrighty, then I'll entertain a motion to go into closed meeting in accordance with 2.2-3711 A15 of the Code of Virginia for prospective business opportunities and the evaluation of staff.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Alrighty.
Thank you.